I didn't know that Ys Spiderman was something I wanted, but here we are. I want to preface this review by saying that I've been a big fan of Ys for a very long time. I think this is important to mention as it's shaped my hopes and expectations of Ys 9 in ways that differ from most. More than a decade ago, I was introduced to Ys through Ys Chronicles 1 and 2, and I quickly fell in love with these older Ys games. They've become the bedrock of what I love about Ys and action RPGs in general. So, to say that I have a bit of a different perspective than many Western reviewers online about modern Ys would be a bit of an understatement. If you ask me, the characteristics that make a great Ys game are great feeling controls, an engaging gameplay loop, fast, furious, and fun combat, memorable and challenging boss battles, a simple and pleasant story that serves to motivate the player, and a really kick-ass soundtrack. Modern Ys captures a lot of what's great about the series, primarily that the gameplay is still fast and frenetic, but in the transition to the modern style, several of these characteristics have been lost in translation. The bland in comparison soundtracks, the switchable characters that make combat less fun, the availability of healing items making bosses way too easy and far less memorable, the complete lack of difficulty unless you go up to like nightmare mode. These have always hindered my enjoyment of modern Ys games. All this built up to a boiling point with Ys 8. In its attempt to cater to the rest of the RPG fanbase, it screwed up the gameplay loop with random interruptions, and the story was suddenly the driving force of the whole game instead of the motivating factor. So while Ys 8 still resembled Ys a bit, there was so much missing that I actually dropped it halfway through my initial playthrough. Though, the awful localization didn't help much either, and I was playing the Vita version. With Ys 9, I didn't want Ys 8. I wanted a return to form. While I was skeptical of Ys 9 like everyone else because of its large departure in gameplay and its aesthetics of the game, as you can see from the title of the review, Ys 9 is the closest thing that a modern Ys game has gotten to what I want out of a Ys game. And I'm happy to say that Ys 9 is a great template for games to follow in the future. First and foremost, the best part about Ys 9 is how it removes barriers to your control and puts an utmost on player agency. It does it better than any other Ys game and many other games in the industry. This is done in many ways, through the new control mechanisms, exploration, the structure of its gameplay loop, and the removal of restrictions. Ys has always been a game where fast and fluid movement has been a huge part of the way it's controlled. And the fact that Ys feels nice to play is a huge part of the appeal. Ys 9 takes these strengths to another level. With the ability to slingshot, climb, and glide, it's incredibly satisfying to move around, and these elements add a whole new level to the game. Traversing the city reminds me of Breath of the Wild, Spider-Man, and how you can go anywhere you want, and moving around is so damn cool. It adds a lot to the game, but I do have some nitpicks. Climbing is kind of a pain. You have to look for areas without ledges, which is frankly dumb. You gave us the ability to climb and go anywhere, so let us climb wherever. If I'm not climbing here, I'll just climb over there. Precision platforming is the other pain point. Platforming has never been good in Ys, and there are areas in this game that might require you to be pretty precise to progress, so that's not all that fun. These are pretty nitpicky complaints though, and the overall level of control that you have in this game is incredibly satisfying and fun. Exploration is one of the best aspects of Ys, and is brought to new heights thanks to the new traversal system. The setting of Ys 9 is open world, which incentivizes exploration, but is not overwhelming because the world unravels as you progress, so you get to know each area well, trying to fill out your map, finding treasure. In Ys, exploration has always been a fun time, but having the Z-axis in play has allowed Falcom to be incredibly clever in hiding things, which brings exploration to a new level. Plus, petals, graffiti, and other elements are sprinkled in all around, so there's a large variety of things to find and new places to go to. The level design is all that more complex because of your increased movement, and it becomes very fun to navigate. A key strength in Ys 9 is how it uses exploration along with other components of the game to create an incredibly addicting gameplay loop. In Ys 9, the gameplay rotates between three distinct phases: quests and exploration, the Grimwald Nox raids, and the story-focused adult sections, with navigating a dungeon chucked in every now and then. What makes this loop satisfying is how the game gives the player the decision to progress when they want. In Ys 8, the raids would randomly interrupt the normal gameplay loop, but here they unlock new parts of the map, and you get to them when you want to, when you have built in 100 Nox from doing stuff around the map, like doing quests or beating monsters. They almost feel like a reward instead of a distraction, And when it's so satisfying to do what you want, whenever you want, it's very easy to enjoy the gameplay. The story component is worth mentioning too, being much better integrated into the gameplay loop versus Ys 8, and it adds a lot to the main story through building intrigue. The story of Ys 9 is one of the most personal stories yet for the series, as the main events of the story directly involve Adol himself. Ys 9 focuses on Adol's adventure in the prison city of Balduk. At the beginning of the game, Adol gets imprisoned, and then a curse is put upon him, making him a Monstrum. Adol is then forced to stop the Grimold Nox from consuming the city along with the other Monstrum, and in his journey to break this curse, the mysteries behind the prison and the Grimold Nox become unveiled. Oftentimes in Ys games, Adol feels like a bystander, a wanderer who happens to stumble in and fix things. This isn't the case with Ys 9, and Adol's importance in the story feels incredibly natural, how I like to see Ys stories go on from here on out. Also, when I'm playing Ys, I'm looking for a story with enough depth and enjoyment to motivate, but something relatively simple, which Ys 9 brings. I loved the story execution near the end, even though the events were predictable because it was satisfying and led to some very nice Adol lines, which is something I've always appreciated. That being said, I did have my handful of complaints with the story. I was not a huge fan of the extreme pacifism and childish writing. Ys 9 tries to justify the Romans even though they've been the big bads throughout the whole series, and tries to paint people fighting against them for Gilead as the bad guys. Self-determination is not a weak or bad cause, and trying to both sides them every time there's a conflict is a simple morality that is irritating. Pacifism isn't everything, and sometimes people are justified for their actions. This isn't a huge part of the story, but it was irritating, and along with Cold Steel, makes me fearful for Falcom's writing in the future. Arbitrary restrictions, for the most part, are gone. Sure, there's restrictions on where you can go and the abilities you have, but those are just at any given time, and they feel like they're there for a reason. They fade away once they've outgrown their necessity. Everything feels like it is the way it is because of thought put into the game, and I really have to appreciate how Ys 9 spends effort removing aspects that annoy people. There's nothing holding you back in this game. All the improvements in Ys 9 versus previous entries ultimately builds up to one conclusion. Player agency is at its best, and I found myself binging through the game in 3 days without ever really wanting to stop, which is really a mark of a great game for me. Ys 9 embraces the strengths of Ys' gameplay by going further into making these elements great, and that feels amazing. But there's a lot of things you can do in Ys 9, and there's very little pressure to do anything at any given time. You get to do what you want to do when you want to do it. Barriers don't feel arbitrary, and they don't feel like they're here to hold you back, but to get more intimate in the areas you're currently exploring. Really, it feels like Ys has been building up into this. So, Ys 9 in regards to movement, exploration, gameplay loop, and story is quite great. But what about the combat, the main draw of Ys? It's a continuation of the modern party system, and personally, I have gripes with it because I've never really liked switching characters. It's not that I have an obsession with Adol or anything, and never want to play as anyone else. It's that, in modern Ys, oftentimes you can get stuck with someone you don't like to control. Because so much of the appeal is with how characters control, that's a big problem. But I can finally say that there's a modern Ys where I'm satisfied with how everyone controls in all three of the categories. As a reminder, there's 3 types of weapons: slashing, striking, and piercing. I've never had any issues with slashing because I could just play as Adol, but traditionally I've had issues with striking because in Ys, those are the slower, bulkier characters, and I appreciate characters that move fast. In general, I felt like Ys 9, there was less of a need to switch, but I liked switching anyways because the White Cat is a fast and frenetic, close-range mastermind, and both of the piercing characters were great. This is basically the first time in a modern Ys game where I've been satisfied with switching between the characters. And while we're on the topic of the cast, I'd like to say that basically everyone here is likable, with maybe the exception of Hawk/Credo. Some modern Ys problems still linger in Ys 9, but they don't bother me here, and they feel more like nitpicks than they really do feel like true complaints. First, Ys 9 is not hard. With every modern Ys game, the games have been getting easier and easier, and you've had to increase the difficulty option to get the same level of difficulty in later games. I played through hard. And what happened was I never did lower than an A rank in the global Nox, and never died to any of the bosses. When I pick hard in a Ys game, I tend to expect at least a game over screen every now and then, providing a challenge I have to overcome. And that didn't happen here. If you're accustomed to Ys games, pick Nightmare at least. That's the old Ys normal. As a side effect for the lack of difficulty, it means the bosses aren't really memorable. In the name of accessibility, modern Ys games have allowed you to use as many healing items as you want in boss fights, making the bosses significantly easier. Boss satisfaction is primarily about you executing your moves well against Sword Being, instead of learning the boss's moves and overcoming them. It's a different kind of satisfaction, and it's not one I prefer, as it leaves the bosses themselves far less memorable and far less exciting to fight. Battling bosses over and over to learn the patterns has made bosses in previous Ys games an event, and were incredibly satisfying to overcome. Plus, if you ever had issues, grinding in Ys is not bad, so you can easily overcome getting stuck. In Ys 9, you can usually beat bosses on the first try. I played on hard and never had any issues. The music is the biggest disappointment in the game. It's serviceable in a general sense, but I was disappointed because Ys traditionally has some of the best music in the industry. The tracks that play over and over again weren't amazing, and there were not a lot of highlights. Every now and then you get a dungeon song that was great, but that was just every now and then. It also has the unfortunate trait of sounding a lot like other Falcom soundtracks, sounding more like a Trails soundtrack than a Ys soundtrack. There were also some town tracks that I really enjoyed, and I do have praises for this soundtrack, but versus something like Ark or Oath of Felghana, I was really disappointed. And last but not least, the presentation. The general gothy, edgy aesthetic is definitely trying too hard in terms of iconography, character design, UI design, etc., and I'm not a fan. This isn't too big of an issue, but in the result of having this gothic aesthetic, is other parts of the game that aren't edgelord just look like bland medieval fantasy, and I would much rather have a bright and colorful aesthetic in my Ys game. To add to this, so far only the PS4 version is out, and I'm really disappointed with the PS4 Pro version in particular. I'm sure it's fine on base, but the Pro version only tops out as 1080p, which is a huge disappointment for anyone who's rocking a 4K TV. It's an especially glaring downgrade from Ys 8, which has a beautiful 4K presentation on PS4 Pro or PS5. And Ys 8 just in general looks better aesthetic-wise from Ys 9. Ys 9 looks good enough that this isn't a big deal, but this is honestly the only downgrade from Ys 8 to me, so that's worth mentioning. So overall, while Ys 9 doesn't hit all the characteristics I expect from a Ys game to excel at, it's the closest thing I've seen from modern Ys games. And it makes up for not hitting all those boxes by building an addicting gameplay loop, giving the player the agency to do what they want whenever they want. The new traversal has brought Ys to new heights, and this game feels better to control than ever before. The story, exploration, and combat all hold up to the rest of the series, and it's really hard to find any large faults in this game. To me, Ys 9 is truly a satisfying game, a great entry into this historic series, and paves the path for the franchise in the future. Honestly, that's really as much as I can ask from any game, and Ys 9 succeeds in spades. Overall, I give Ys 9 a 9 out of 10. This has been Reikaze Rambles, signing off.